Three crises, one administration, and a single week that may define the trajectory of an entire presidency. As Americans wake up this morning, they are confronting an extraordinary convergence of pressures, economic, logistical, and legal, that together paint a picture of a government stretched in multiple directions simultaneously. In the skies above American airports, tens of thousands of federal security workers are showing up to their posts without paychecks, producing some of the most severe travel disruptions this country has seen in years. On the global economic stage, a major international forecasting body has just released projections showing United States inflation climbing to levels not seen since the Federal Reserve's most aggressive tightening cycle in modern history, driven directly by the war now raging in the Middle East. And in the halls of Congress, a rarely unified coalition of Republicans and Democrats has taken the extraordinary step of issuing a formal subpoena to the sitting Attorney General of the United States, demanding she appear under oath to answer questions about the government's handling of one of the most closely watched federal investigations in a generation. These three storylines are unfolding simultaneously, intersecting in ways that are creating compounding political, economic, and institutional pressures on the White House. None of them is simple, none of them is resolved, and taken together they represent a moment of genuine national reckoning that deserves to be examined with the precision, care, and contextual depth that the American public requires. Tonight we do exactly that, story by story, fact by fact, source by source. We begin with the economic picture because it is the one that reaches most directly into the daily lives of ordinary Americans. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, one of the world's most respected economic forecasting institutions, has just released a new projection. United States inflation is expected to climb to 4.2% in 2026. To put that figure in context, the average inflation rate throughout all of 2025 was 2.68%. The projected jump represents a dramatic acceleration, one driven in substantial part by what the OECD's own report describes as a surge in energy prices and disruption to the global supply of energy and other critical commodities caused directly by the conflict now underway in the Middle East. The price Americans are paying at the gas pump is one of the clearest and most immediate expressions of this economic shift. According to data released by AAA, the American Automobile Association, with the national average price of a gallon of regular gasoline stood at $3.98 as of this week, a full dollar more per gallon than it was just 1 month ago. That figure represents a staggering acceleration in energy costs that, according to economists, will ripple through the entire economy in the weeks and months ahead. Mark Zandi, the chief economist at Moody's Analytics, stated directly to CNBC that consumers are at serious risk of being hammered by the surge in oil prices. Zandi warned that if oil prices stay near their elevated levels, inflation will accelerate sharply, cutting into purchasing power, weighing on consumer spending, and ultimately affecting economic growth and employment. The connection between the Middle East conflict and these rising prices is direct and documented. Global oil prices have surged by more than 25% since the conflict began on February 28, according to reporting from Al Jazeera and multiple energy market analysts. The Brent crude price climbed from $81.40 per barrel in early March to over $106 per barrel by March 20th, a rise of more than 30% in under 3 weeks. Oil briefly eclipsed $100 a barrel for the first time since Russia's invasion of Ukraine. California gasoline prices surged past $5 a gallon during the second week of March. These are not abstract numbers, they represent real costs being absorbed by real families across the country every single day. The Federal Reserve, which has been navigating an already complicated economic landscape, is now confronting a fresh challenge. The Fed had held interest rates steady at 4.5% through much of early 2026, adopting a wait-and-see posture as it assessed the impact of tariffs and other policy changes on inflation and the labor market. That cautious approach is now under renewed pressure, Goldman Sachs has stated that if oil prices remain at their current levels for several months, United States consumer price inflation could climb from the 2.4% level recorded in January to as high as 3% by year's end, and that projection was offered before the most recent acceleration in energy prices driven by the Strait of Hormuz disruptions. With the OECD now projecting 4.2% for the full year, the Fed faces a genuinely difficult set of choices about how to respond without either allowing inflation to become entrenched or tipping the economy into recession. Stephen Cates, a certified financial planner and analyst at Bankrate, noted that oil price increases are fundamentally different from tariff-driven inflation in one crucial respect. Unlike the tariff impacts, which filtered gradually into consumer prices over months, increases in oil prices are reflected in consumer costs almost immediately. The connection from the refinery to the gas pump to the grocery shelf operates on a time scale of days, not months. Every item that requires transportation, which is to say essentially every item that consumers buy, becomes more expensive when fuel costs rise. And they are rising. The World Economic Forum, in an analysis published this week, described the economic consequences of the Middle East conflict as a structural shock to the world economy, delivered at a moment of geo-economic fragility. The forum's analysis noted that the Strait of Hormuz carries not just crude oil, approximately 20 million barrels per day passed through it in 2025, but also roughly one-fifth of global liquefied natural gas trade, fertilizers critical to global food production, and components of high-technology supply chains. Since commercial traffic through the strait was severely disrupted following the opening strikes on Iran last month, the cascading consequences have already begun to reshape global commodity markets, food systems, and industrial supply chains. Wheat prices have moved higher. Fertilizer prices are projected to rise sharply. The economic pain from this disruption is not confined to the United States. It is radiating across the globe. President Trump has publicly characterized the short-term rise in oil prices as, in his words, a very small price to pay, predicting that prices will fall once the Iran mission has concluded. But academic and market economists have offered more cautious assessments. Nada Sanders, a distinguished professor of supply chain and information management at Northeastern University, described oil markets as being at panic levels due to the uncertainty surrounding the Strait of Hormuz. Sanders noted that even in the event of a diplomatic deal or sanctions relief, oil prices would likely fall only modestly, and that the transition of Iranian oil back into mainstream markets would require significant time to accomplish. The economic architecture of this moment, in the assessment of serious analysts, cannot simply be reversed overnight. Now we turn to the second crisis simultaneously gripping the nation, the ongoing and worsening disruption at American airports, where more than 61,000 Transportation Security Administration employees have been working without full pay since a partial government shutdown affecting the Department of Homeland Security began on February 14th. The consequences of that funding lapse are now visible to millions of American travelers in the form of hours-long lines at security checkpoints, overwhelmed airports, and a workforce that has been pushed to the edge of its limits. The scale of the crisis is documented in stark official testimony. TSA Administrator Han Nguyen McNeil, testifying before the House Oversight Committee on Wednesday, described conditions that are genuinely alarming. TSA employees are working at over 430 commercial airports across the United States. As of March 27th, the agency has logged nearly $1 billion in payroll that has not been paid in a timely manner. More than 460 TSA officers have quit since the shutdown began, and daily call-out rates, the percentage of scheduled workers who simply do not show up, have climbed from a pre-shutdown baseline of approximately 4% to over 11% nationwide. Multiple airports have experienced call-out rates exceeding 40 and even 50% on individual shifts. The human cost to the TSA workforce has been documented by the agency itself and confirmed by union representatives. McNeil told Congress that officers are sleeping in their cars at airports to save fuel money. Officers are donating plasma to generate income. Some are taking on second and third jobs just to cover basic expenses. TSA union member Tatiana Finlay told CNN that she has reached the point of having to skip meals to ensure her children are fed. The American Federation of Government Employees Union has noted that many TSA employees earn an average of approximately $35,000 per year. Workers who live paycheck to paycheck under ordinary circumstances and who have now gone 6 weeks without a full paycheck. The impact on travelers has been severe and spreading. Houston's George Bush Intercontinental Airport, one of the nation's busiest travel hubs, has seen security wait times swell to 4 hours or more. Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, New York's JFK, and airports in Baltimore, New Orleans, and other major cities have all reported extraordinary delays. The TSA has warned that if staffing conditions worsen further, some smaller airports may be forced to reduce or cease screening operations entirely. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy characterized the current disruptions as, in his words, child's play compared to what could happen if TSA workers miss another paycheck. The agency is also grappling with a simultaneous spring break travel surge, handling approximately 5% more passengers than the same period last year, while operating with dramatically fewer staff. The political dimensions of the TSA funding standoff are contested and complex. The root cause is a broader budget impasse over the Department of Homeland Security, specifically a dispute over funding for immigration and customs enforcement. The administration has deployed ICE agents to airports to assist with crowd management, a decision that has drawn sharp criticism from TSA union officials, who have noted that ICE agents are not trained in security screening and cannot perform the actual work of keeping airports safe. The comparison has been particularly pointed given that ICE agents are receiving their paychecks while TSA agents are not, a discrepancy that union representatives have described as deeply insulting to the workforce. The legislative stalemate has produced an unusual set of political dynamics. Senate Democrats have repeatedly offered to pass legislation funding TSA and most of DHS, excluding ICE enforcement operations. Senate Republicans have proposed funding DHS broadly, except for ICE enforcement and removal operations. The White House has sent mixed signals throughout the negotiations. On Thursday, President Trump announced on Truth Social that he would sign an executive order instructing the Secretary of Homeland Security, Markwayne Mullin, to immediately pay TSA agents using existing funding authorities. Trump described the situation as an emergency and framed the airport chaos as the result of, in his words, Democrat recklessness. Shortly after Trump's announcement, the Senate unanimously agreed during an overnight session to fund most of DHS, including the TSA, though the bill still requires approval from the House of Representatives to take effect. Aviation security experts have raised concerns that go beyond mere inconvenience. Keith Jeffries, who previously ran TSA operations at Los Angeles International Airport, stated that the surge in wait times creates genuine security vulnerabilities, not because screeners are less skilled, but because chaotic conditions make it more difficult to maintain the level of focused attention that effective security screening requires. John Pistoli, who served as TSA administrator during the Obama administration, echoed this concern, noting that security personnel worried about paying rent or buying groceries face the same human challenges as anyone else, and that distraction is a real operational risk. This is a workforce, Pistoli emphasized, that was designed specifically to prevent another September 11th, and it deserves to be treated accordingly. The third major story we must address is one that transcends partisan lines and touches on foundational questions of transparency, constitutional accountability, and the rule of law. The House Oversight Committee, in a vote of 24-19 on March 4th, issued a formal subpoena to United States Attorney General Pam Bondi. The subpoena, which passed with bipartisan support, 5 Republicans joining the committee's Democrats in supporting the measure, requires Bondi to appear for a sworn deposition on April 14th to answer questions about the Justice Department's handling of records related to the federal investigation of Jeffrey Epstein. The Epstein files matter is one that has drawn sustained scrutiny from across the political spectrum. Congress passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act with near-unanimous bipartisan support, requiring the Department of Justice to publicly release all of its investigative files related to Epstein and his convicted accomplice Ghislaine Maxwell. Following a months-long review process in which Bondi said more than 500 attorneys and reviewers spent thousands of hours examining millions of pages of documents, the DOJ released more than 3 million pages of material in late January 2026. However, the DOJ subsequently indicated it would not release the remaining files, a collection that reportedly numbers more than 2.5 million additional documents. Critics on both sides of the aisle have argued that the files that were released were overly and sometimes inappropriately redacted. Reports have emerged that the DOJ removed from public view tens of thousands of documents that had previously been made accessible. The subpoena vote itself was notable for its bipartisan character. Republican Representative Nancy Mace of South Carolina was the driving force behind the subpoena motion, joined by fellow Republicans Tim Burchett of Tennessee, Lauren Boebert of Colorado, Michael Cloud of Texas, and Scott Perry of Pennsylvania. Representative Robert Garcia of California, the top Democrat on the committee, stated that Bondi had been instrumental in orchestrating what he described as a cover-up of the Epstein files and had failed to comply with Congress's bipartisan demands for full transparency. Garcia expressed the committee's determination that the American people deserve answers and that survivors of Epstein's abuse deserve justice. Prior to the subpoena being formally issued, Oversight Chairman James Comer disclosed that Bondi had offered to provide members of the committee with an informal briefing about the DOJ's handling of the Epstein files, a few members at a time, rather than submit to a formal sworn deposition. Committee members were quick to note the significant legal distinction between these two forms of congressional engagement. A briefing is not recorded in the official congressional record. A briefing does not produce a sworn transcript. A briefing does not place the witness under oath, meaning statements made during such a session carry no legal liability for inaccuracy. The formal deposition subpoenaed by the committee requires the Attorney General to raise her right hand, swear to tell the truth, and answer questions on the record with the full legal consequences that perjury carries. The DOJ's position, articulated through a spokesperson, is that the subpoena is unnecessary, pointing to the department's stated cooperation and the volume of materials already released. However, critics argue that the definition of compliance with the Epstein Files Transparency Act is not for the DOJ to determine unilaterally. The law was passed by Congress with a clear mandate, and several members on both sides of the aisle believe that mandate has not been fully honored. House Oversight Chair Comer issued the formal subpoena on March 17th, setting April 14th as the date for Bondi's required testimony. The broader context of the Epstein investigation includes a history of public statements by Bondi that have later required clarification or retraction. In February of 2025, early in her tenure as Attorney General, Bondi told Fox News that Epstein's client list was, in her words, "sitting on my desk right now." By July of that same year, she had walked back those remarks, stating that no such list existed. This trajectory of statements has contributed to sustained skepticism about the DOJ's transparency on the matter among lawmakers who otherwise support the administration on many other fronts. The appointment of Todd Blanche as Deputy Attorney General has added another layer of scrutiny to the Justice Department's handling of the Epstein matter. Blanche, who served as President Trump's personal criminal defense attorney before joining the DOJ, has participated in the briefings offered to Congress regarding the Epstein files. His dual role as Trump's former defense lawyer and now as a senior official of the department overseeing the Epstein investigation has raised questions from committee members about the independence of the DOJ's review process. Those questions are part of what the April 14th deposition is intended to address. Stepping back from these three individual stories to view them together reveals a portrait of an administration simultaneously managing a military campaign abroad, a logistical crisis at home, and a legal accountability confrontation in Congress. Each of these crises has its own internal logic, its own timeline, and its own set of potential resolutions. But they also interact with and amplify one another in ways that are creating compounding pressures. The economic consequences of the Middle East conflict are being felt by the same working-class Americans who are also experiencing travel disruptions at airports, staffed by a workforce that hasn't been fully paid in 6 weeks. The political credibility challenges created by rising gas and grocery prices are playing out against the backdrop of a Justice Department under formal congressional subpoena. The administration's communication bandwidth, its ability to manage multiple crises simultaneously, is being tested in real time. What happens next on each of these fronts will unfold over the coming days and weeks. On the economic front, the direction of oil prices and the pace of any diplomatic resolution to the Strait of Hormuz situation will be the primary determinant of whether inflation accelerates further or begins to stabilize. On the TSA funding crisis, the critical near-term question is whether President Trump's executive order to pay TSA workers will be implemented quickly enough to stabilize airport operations ahead of the weekend travel surge, and whether Congress will pass a broader DHS funding solution before workers face another missed paycheck cycle. On the Epstein files and the Bondi subpoena, the April 14th deposition date is the next major milestone, and the question of whether the Attorney General will comply with the committee's legally binding demand or seek to challenge it will define the next chapter of this ongoing confrontation. The Federal Reserve's next scheduled policy meeting will be watched closely by financial markets for any signal about how central bank officials are thinking about the inflation trajectory in light of the Middle East conflict's impact on energy prices. The FIFA World Cup, which is set to begin on June 11th, less than 3 months away, has added urgency to the TSA funding crisis, with the agency warning that officers hired after a resolution of the shutdown would not complete their training in time to work the World Cup travel surge. What this convergence of crises ultimately illuminates is the extent to which events can outpace any administration's capacity to manage them individually, let alone all at once. The men and women who screen passengers at America's airports, the families paying nearly $4 a gallon for gasoline, and the survivors of Jeffrey Epstein's abuse who are still waiting for the full truth. All of these groups have a direct stake in how these stories resolve. Their patience, their finances, and in some cases their personal safety have already been affected by decisions made in Washington and on the world stage. The American political system was designed precisely for moments like this, moments when multiple pressures converge and when the accountability mechanisms of democratic governance, from congressional oversight to independent economic institutions to a free press, are put to their most serious test. The weeks ahead will reveal how well those mechanisms continue to function. This is your nightly news briefing. We will continue to bring you full, verified coverage of each of these developing stories as they evolve